very interesting. It's something that Will and I had talked about not only on a previous program, but in conversations since. And as Will and I have chatted, and this is the first time you've probably heard this, maybe not, the modern day Star Trek Next Generation was dubbed by a very good friend of mine back in Phoenix as we would chat about this, both of us big Trekkie fans. The Next Generation series specifically was, as he put it, our modern day mythology. Oh. But as you have spoken about this aspect of hearing the call, heeding the call, and then giving yourself up to a higher power. Now, then this is sort of the first time I've actually put it in this context on the radio broadcast. And so I want people to understand that I'm not advocating anything. I am just putting forth an idea.
Good.
You're familiar with the series.
I am, but not.
I won't go into detail.
I'm not going to be
quizzed. No, you're not going to be quizzed. No.
Okay.
You're familiar with one of the characters that was brought in called the Borg.
The Borg.
Yes.
The collective.
Yes.
And setting aside the destructive habits of the Borg to assimilate other civilizations against their will, there is no one singular mind that is in control. It is the collective.
Mm-hmm.
And yet they function quite well. They get the job done, whatever it might be. When we talk about, and Will and I talked about this just recently, the intuition.
Yeah.
And let's use that as the context for hearing the call. Mm-hmm. I instruct people that they should listen to their intuition, that it will never, ever, 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 ever lead you astray, that it will never put you in harm's way. It will challenge you, but it will never put you in harm's way. Then the next step is, and I went through a personal growth program of an intensive, a 5-day intensive, where I wrote down on a big old piece of paper that I was not just going to listen to the still small voice, but I was going to follow through. I was going to do what it asked me to do. What's the point of listening if you're not going to follow it? You know, if you're not going to follow it, then don't listen.
Oh my gosh, you're like the paradox, the beauty and the paradox you're describing is awesome. You're saying you have to submit your own self to listen to yourself. Submit your own self and dissolve your own self in order to listen to yourself.
In a manner, exactly. But then there comes the other element that you and I talked about just a few days ago. And that has to do with this whole business of free will and, yes, the ego, but also, and I'm going to tie in the Borg into this. When you choose to do the first two steps, you are basically acknowledging that you are now, in a manner of speaking, giving up your will for the collective, for the good of all. And for example, there are 3 of us in the room. Each one of us can listen to our individual intuition. And each one of us will be given different directives. However, all 3 directives are congruent with the big picture, with the collective.
Yes.
So there is so it's almost as if, and you and I talked about this, Will, in terms of where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. Where we've been, the one. Where we are, duality, Maya, the illusion. Where we're going, the one. And in order to get back to the one, we have to go through this individualistic mentality, mindset, in order to make the next step that I've just described of saying, how willing are you to bring about a better life for all?
Yeah.
Are you willing to let go of the self?
Yeah.
So are there, so is this, at this level, is this the importance of mythology in our lifetime today? To teach us that, to show us that?
Yeah, and it's the basis of Buddhism as well as I understand it. That
I'm sorry, Buddhism?
Buddhism.
Oh, Buddhism. I beg your pardon.
And I read Buddhist thought as I teach the Divine Comedy, and it's astonishing how they are in such great correspondence. Self-absorption is hell itself in the Buddhist thought. Most specifically in Shantideva's A Guide to the a bodhisattva way of life, written in the 8th century. This is exactly what's taking place in the 3 canticas of Dante's Divine Comedy. All of the souls in Inferno suffer alone. All of the souls in Purgatory suffer in community. Now they're suffering, but they're on a different qualitative level, and they're also suffering in hope. It's different to suffer hopelessly, and it's to suffer hopefully. And those 2 realms constitute 70% of the entire journey. Now, what has happened to the souls in Inferno? They made themselves their own deity, and they were then caught in a myth that calcified and fixated. And that's their condition for eternity as Dante travels through it.
Imprison themselves in themselves.
They're imprisoned in themselves. And I mean, I forget the Shakespeare play, might be Hamlet. We make a heaven of hell or hell of heaven. We do that to ourselves. Maybe Othello, one of the tragedies. But in the purgatorial realm, one suffers in community and gets out of oneself in actually helping others make it up Mount Purgatory. And then in the last realm, they are already in that state of a kind of mystical bliss, a very tough part of the poem to grasp, in part because it moves towards abstraction. But the other 2 worlds are very fleshy, very meaty. The ones in Purgatorio I think, are the ones who are still living in a viable, organic myth. In Inferno, they have frozen. And then we get the figure of Satan himself, deep in the bowels of that cone, and he's frozen in ice. So hell, on one level, isn't about fire; it's about frozenness in ice. So,
Stuck, basically.
Richard, I hope that at least touched on when a myth dehydrates, becomes anemic. It moves towards fundamentalism in all of its forms. So if we look around the world today at the forms of fundamentalism, which can be about a religious fundamentalism, but maybe about fundamentalism on what you're eating.
Even science.
And science.
Politics, science.
Politics. It's an attitude, and it's a rigid paralysis. So I don't think there's any more practical discipline to study today than mythology. I think if taken seriously, it would make countries question, do we understand this adversary's myth? And given our understanding of it, is invading this country really in our best interest? In other words, my fantasy has been for years that the president ought to have a mythologist on his board of advisors, his or her. I'm going to stay the open up. Because the perspective that myth gives gets outside of policy, which itself is policy making is a mythic structure, but it is not conscious of itself in ways that I think it could be if mythically inflected.
I know that a lot of people are listening, including myself, who haven't read the classic myths. I mean, Will has a pile of books over here to my left that I've never seen before in my life, let alone read. I've heard some of the Greek gods, for example. I've heard some of the, and we talked about Aesop's fables. Those are mythical stories with a moral to them, and so forth. And so when the two of you are dialoguing, I must extrapolate as much as I can from the words I do understand.
Sure.
And it's almost as though we sort of need a dictionary or something of this nature. So let me ask you, I know what my metaphysical primer is.
Yes.
What would be a good mythological primer for the beginner who is intrigued by everything that's being spoken about here, such as myself, but doesn't really have the time or the inclination to read some of these massive volumes as much as we'd like to. And that's where I feel our educational system has really dropped the ball, because I think that so much so much time is wasted on things that have no relevance.
No, that's right.
So tell me, what would be a good primer?
Well, he's just opened the. You so beautifully
have I opened
the door.
Pandora's box?
No. You've opened a segue. The fundamental intention in writing this book was to be a primer for people who want. Oh, sorry.
There we go.
Okay. Who
and tell us the book's title for the radio listener.
Yes, it's entitled "Writing Myth, Mythic Writing," but you can't see the spelling. The first writing is R-I-T-I-N-G.
Okay.
The second writing adds a W, because writing is, I believe, a ritual way to get at knowing something that one has maybe half formed. The intention of the book is to engage the reader's myth. Let me just name a couple of chapters. Engaging the myth that writes you with an R, not W. Writing the aesthetic self, mythopoiesis. Writing through the embodied self. Writing the wounded self. So the intention of the book is to offer a modest amount of information on myth and inflect it to personal myth, and then invite the reader into their own narrative identity along a particular corridor through a series of questions, because it's my belief that writing opens those parts of us up that even in speaking can still remain concealed.
So you're talking more than just journaling here. Each one of us can actually create our own mythology.
Yes.
Based upon
or you
our
might
lives.
even say we already do have somewhat of a mythology, and we don't even know it.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, how many apples are in our movies? How many apples are on teachers' desks? And we don't even think twice when we see that apple that this apple has deep, deep, deep meaning. And we know for a fact Steve Jobs had this particular apple, and even more specifically, Newton's apple in mind when he designed the Apple logo. So I would argue that we are, Pandora, you mentioned Pandora's box. How many diamond advertisements do you see that say Pandora on them? We're inundated by myth, whether we know it or not. I was recently lucky enough to be in Budapest, and I asked my tour guide, I said, do you guys in your classrooms, do you study mythology, classics, etc.? He said, well, if we didn't study the classics, how would we know what's going on in the art in our museums? And I said, I'm not sure that most of us in the United States could answer that way, because I think a lot of us don't know the art in museums and the apple in the middle of a Disney movie. And I think what you're describing about this book is an opportunity to work into your own personal myth, into the myths of the world, and to find that relationship that is both there and can be developed with myth.
Yes.
Now, there's also an element, too, of symbolism. I mean, you're using the symbol of the apple. And the unspoken understanding of the apple can only be derived from having some level of experience with an apple, having some level of experience having heard stories about the apple, whether it be from a biblical perspective or Shakespeare or the Greek tragedies, etc., on infinitum. And, I've often thought about this whole aspect of symbology or symbolism, in that if I was to take a book and just take, say, the first sentence, every single word evokes an image in one's mind. And then you start putting those words together, and that sentence now starts to evoke a particular image in one's mind, those symbols, and on and on and on.
And whether you take the time to actually think about those symbols or not, Your brain does.
Yeah.